This is a demonstration video on how I do a comprehensive bearing service on my Dura-Ace PD-7900 pedals, which are in bad need of service. And I will be doing the right pedal. On this particular pedal, the spindle assembly, once removed, has two rings of bearings. The larger ring toward the crank has 17 bearings, and the smaller ring outside of the pedal has 9 bearings. They're all 3/32. They're all very small. If your pedal is clicking, you've probably already had a few bearings come out, or you may lose them. So it's a good idea to maybe buy a bag of them. So I'll be doing the right pedal. The treads that attach it to the crank are conventional, but the housing the housing threads are reversed, so you actually have to go clockwise on the right pedal to loosen it. You actually loosen the lock nut, which is against the housing. That's a larger flange, and I'm using an adjustable wrench for that. And again, I'm going clockwise to loosen. If it was the left pedal, you would be going counterclockwise. They're usually torqued on pretty good. Some people clamp this in a vise to do it, but I find I'm able to do it with the adjustable wrench. So when you unscrew that, the spindle will come out. There's 2 bushings. One of them will typically stay in. There you can see the bearings. So that's the plastic bushing, and we'll clean that up and put that on. It does have an orientation, and there are the bearings right there in the race. The other bushing is down in there, and it's obscuring the view of the bearings down there, so we're going to want to pull all that out to clean it out anyway. So I'm just going to use a long, thin tool to get down there and just get that bushing out of there. And you can use just about anything to get down there, small flat blade screwdriver or something. And there's an orientation to that, and I'll discuss that on the assembly of it. So now you can see the 9 bearings down there in the outer race of the spindle housing, and we'll get those out and clean them up. So what I'm going to do now is just degrease these bearings. There's a circlip that holds it in, and you don't really have to remove the circlip. They can come out through the little gap in the circlip. So now I've cleaned the grease out with some solvent, and so I have to roll each bearing over to the gap in the circlip to have them just fall out of there. And you want to make sure you find each one and get them out of there. And again, there's 17 of them on this circle, so you want to just check that. We'll clean that all up after getting those out of there. The solvent, by the way, that I'm spraying with is penetrating oil, and I find it's a good cleaning and degreasing product. For really stubborn areas, I might use a unchlorinated brake cleaner. So there's a washer that I just took off of there, and now I'm spraying the solvent down in there to get those bearings to loosen up and washing out all that grease, and they'll dump out of there when you clean it with enough grease. So there should be 26 bearings, so if you don't get 26 out of there, you want to get a few from your bag of bearings. Now we're just cleaning up all the surfaces, getting the races all cleaned up and getting the old grease off of there. That lock nut, you want to make sure it spins freely. That's what you're going to use to both tighten the housing in there, and that also helps you adjust the bearing clearance and bearing load. Now I'll discuss that on the assembly of the pedal after cleanup. For the housing there, these are gun barrel cloth patches that I find are very handy for getting down to those tight places and cleaning that out and getting the old grease out of there. So that's been cleaned out. So now we're going to start assembling. I'm going to start putting the bearings back into the races. So for the larger circle, I don't put grease in there. It's easier to position and roll the bearings around without grease in. You have to put each one in through the circlip gap one by one. And this is a little bit tedious. Some people use a tool with a little bit of grease on it, or a magnetized tip, and I kind of just fumble around with my fingers or whatever I can do to get them in there. gets a little bit clumsy, but after a while you get the rhythm and you start getting them all in there. And once they're in, you want to count them, because you can actually put more than 17 in and they'll be cramped in there and double stacked. That's not good. And if there's less than 17, you'll see gaps. So you want to make sure there's a nice ring flat in the inner race. If there's any clearance, it will be they'll fall out through the circlip into the housing. So so we want to make sure the pressure on them is correct. For the housing now, I'm just going to put a glob of grease down at the end of it, on the end of a screwdriver. I'm just going to put that down there and spread it around a little bit and make sure the outer race down in the spindle housing is greased up. And then I'll just drop the 9 remaining bearings down into the housing and let gravity bring them down there. Now, of course, they won't fall into the right position, but they just have to be down toward the end in the grease. This is a T25 Torx driver, which I found is a really good tool to push the bearings into the correct position. So here they are, you're looking down there, they're just laying down in that blob of grease. But if you gently work this tool down into there, it will push the bearings into the grease, into the race, into the correct position, and then they'll be seated properly for when you assemble the spindle. So you just got to sort of push the bearings into place and then seat that thing down there. And you could also probably use an Allen key, or there they are, all nice in position. You might be able to use an Allen key or a Phillips head screwdriver to do that. So now the larger ring, I'm going to start greasing that up. And just working on there with the tool, and then I'll push it in with my fingers into the bearings, and also give all the other components a light layer of grease. This is just general purpose automotive lithium grease. And now the plastic bushing is tapered on the inside, and if you put it in the wrong orientation, it will not slide far enough along the spindle, and then you will not be able to reassemble it. So when you slide it on, put it on both ways, and whichever way slides it the farther down, that is the correct orientation for that bushing. And then the other metal bushing, that's not tapered. It'll go on either way, but the outside of it is tapered. And if that's incorrect, you will also not be able to insert it. So the narrower end has to be farther out. It's kind of hard to see. You may have to insert it to know if it's in the right orientation or not. So you have to put those 2 bushings on, and then I put a little daub of grease at the very end to make sure the other bearing ring is nicely greased up. Now on assembly, I forgot to put the washer on. You can see it laying on the workbench there behind me. So this is take 2. The bushing got left in there, and the washer is now on. But I also wanted to take an opportunity to just show that lock nut relationship to the race housing. So you want to screw that all the way out so it's against the outer flange. There should be no gap between the lock nut and the outer 17 millimeter flange, and that's so when you screw this in, you'll be able to put a little bit of pressure. There's the gap right there. So I'm going to screw that back the other way so that it's against it without a gap. So now when I turn this into the housing, at some point I'll start to put a little pressure on the bearings, and that's you want to be able to find that point. So now we're going to assemble that. Again, right pedal, you're going to go opposite. You're going to go counterclockwise to tighten that up. So now I'm feeling pressure. So I test the spindle. There's still no friction. So my greasy fingers don't have enough grip. So now I'm going to use a 17 millimeter wrench to tighten until I feel some pressure. And now I feel friction on the spindle. Don't put too much pressure on them or you'll damage. I'm going to back it off a quarter turn. So I've basically tightened it up so I just feel a little bit of friction on the bearings, and then loosen it. Now there's no more friction or play. So that should be perfect. I'm going to use the adjustable wrench to tighten the lock nut against the housing. So now now there will be a gap. I've spun the nut back against the housing, and now I'm turning, really torquing it down and double checking again, no excessive friction or free play, and I hope you found this video helpful. Thank you very much for watching, and cheers.